How does a fortress land without its gear? For the 10 men of the B-17 Flying Fortress patched up asterisk on the 20th of February, 1943, this was not a theoretical question. It was a brutal, imminent reality. Over the frozen, hostile expanse of the North Atlantic, a crippled bomber was descending, its vital landing gear sheared away by a collision with the sea. Inside, a young pilot faced a decision with no good answers: ditch in the icy, killing water, or attempt the impossible. What followed was not just a feat of airmanship, but a 200-mile-per-hour slide into legend that defied every expectation of survival. Our story begins at the height of the Allied campaign against German U-boats, the Battle of the Atlantic. Based at RCAF Station Gander in Newfoundland, the 20th Anti-Submarine Squadron of the United States Army Air Forces flew long, grueling patrols over the convoy routes. Their weapon, the B-17F Flying Fortress, a 4-engine heavy bomber modified for maritime patrol. On paper, a formidable aircraft. In the harsh North Atlantic environment, a complex machine vulnerable to the elements, fatigue, and catastrophic luck. Commanding patched up on this fateful mission was 22-year-old First Lieutenant John Jack K. Kidd. His co-pilot was Second Lieutenant William Bud S. Farnsworth. They were not combat veterans of the European theater, but they were experts in a different kind of warfare, a war of attrition against the sea and the unseen enemy beneath it. Their mission that February day was a standard anti-submarine sweep. The weather was typical: poor visibility, towering cloud banks, and the ever-present threat of icing. The aircraft, like many tasked with these endless patrols, was living up to its name, a collection of repaired parts and weary systems. As they droned through the gray void, the crew monitored their instruments, scanned the iron-gray waves for a periscope's wake, and fought off the numbing cold. They were performing a routine duty, critical to the Allied supply line, yet far from the headlines. But the North Atlantic required constant vigilance, not just against the enemy, but against itself. The patrol progressed without incident for hours. Then, the routine shattered. Encountering a severe, sudden squall line, visibility dropped to near zero. Icing began to coat the wings. Lieutenant Kidd initiated a gradual descent, seeking clearer air and warmer temperatures below the cloud layer. They broke through the overcast at just 800 feet above the churning ocean. The world outside was a monochrome hell of whitecaps and spray. And then, the impact. A massive jolt rocked the aircraft. A sickening, grinding screech of tearing metal screamed from beneath the fuselage. The controls shook violently in Kidd and Farnsworth's hands. In the cockpit, warning lights flickered. The bomber shuddered but remained airborne. A frantic check of systems began. Engines were running. Controls were responsive, but sluggish. The initial, chilling assessment: they had struck the water. Not a crash, but a high-speed, glancing blow from a massive swell that had risen unseen from the gloom. But the full extent of the damage was yet to be discovered. The radio operator, Staff Sergeant Thomas R. Alford, reported severe distortion in his sets, likely from antenna damage. The waist gunners confirmed the worst. Looking aft, they saw not the sleek lines of the B-17's underside, but a tangled wreck. The ball turret, protruding from the belly, had been completely torn away on impact. And with it, the entire hydraulic system had been eviscerated. Fluid streamed into the slipstream. This meant no turret guns, no flaps, and most critically, no landing gear. The massive main wheels and nose wheel were trapped in their wells, their mechanisms severed and useless. By 14:20 hours, the situation was clear and dire. Patched Up was a flying wreck, losing fuel and hydraulic fluid over 300 miles from the nearest friendly field. Ditching a B-17 in the North Atlantic, even in good condition, was a death sentence for most. The aircraft was notorious for its violent, short-lived buoyancy. In waters just above freezing, survival time was measured in minutes. Lieutenant Kidd knew the statistics. He made the only choice he could: turn the wounded giant towards the distant coast and pray. For 2 agonizing hours, the crew worked to save their aircraft and themselves. They jettisoned everything not bolted down: ammunition, depth charges, equipment to lighten the load and extend their glide. They used hand pumps to salvage what little hydraulic pressure they could, but the gear refused to budge. The engineers confirmed it. The linkages were not just broken, they were gone. The bomber would have to land on its belly. And no B-17 had ever survived a belly landing with its full crew. The fuselage would likely snap, the fuel tanks would rupture, and the inevitable fire would consume all. As the Newfoundland coastline emerged from the mist, the crisis entered its final, desperate phase. They were approaching RCAF Station Gander, but landing there was out of the question. A belly landing on a short, active runway crowded with parked aircraft would be a catastrophe for all. Kidd requested and received permission to divert to a nearby emergency field, the newly constructed, but not yet operational, runway at Goose Bay. It was longer, clearer, and offered their only slim chance. Now, the grim preparations began inside the trembling fortress. The crew secured all loose items. They donned their heavy flying suits and Mae West life jackets, a grim irony for a landing on solid ground. They assumed crash positions, bracing against bulkheads and structural frames. The gunners in the waist and tail were especially vulnerable, positioned in the thin-skinned rear of the aircraft that would bear the brutal force of the slide. Fear gripped the men, not of the enemy, but of the machine that had carried them so far and was now their shared metal coffin. The silence on the interphone was heavy, broken only by terse commands from the cockpit. Lieutenant Kidd lined up patched up with the endless-seeming ribbon of Goose Bay's runway. He had one advantage. The field was covered in a thick, smooth layer of hard-packed snow and ice. It might reduce friction. It might also dig in and cartwheel the aircraft. With no flaps to slow them, and no way to trim the aircraft correctly for a wheels-up landing, their approach speed was a terrifying 200 miles per hour. The normal landing speed for a fortress was barely half that. The 4 roaring engines were the only sound. Kidd and Farnsworth coordinated flawlessly. Their plan was brutal in its simplicity. Fly the aircraft onto the ground as level as possible, cut all engines at the last second to prevent fire, and hold the nose off the ground for as long as humanly possible. The moment the belly touched, they would lose all control. The aircraft would become a 25-ton sled, careening into an unknown fate. Prepare for impact. The words were calm, final. The runway threshold rushed beneath them. The screech of torn metal meeting solid ice was deafening, a sound that drilled into the bones of every man aboard. A storm of sparks and shattered ice crystals engulfed the cockpit windows. The world dissolved into a violent, shuddering chaos. The roar was unlike anything they had ever heard, a primal scream of aluminum, steel, and ice being ground into oblivion. For what felt like an eternity, the B-17 slid, a comet of sparks and noise on the frozen waste. The men were thrown against their restraints, vision blurring, ears filled with the catastrophic din of their own destruction. The tail began to slew. Would it hold? A wingtip dug in, threatening to flip them. Miraculously, it bounced free. The nose, held aloft by Kidd's sheer strength on the controls, began its inevitable descent. It settled onto the ice with a final, crushing groan. And then silence. A sudden, shocking, absolute silence, broken only by the ping of cooling metal and the moan of the wind. In that silence, a new fear took hold, fire. Fuel lines were ruptured. Sparks had flown for thousands of feet. The order was shouted, "Get out! Everyone out!" Hatches were flung open. The crew, battered and dazed, stumbled into the blinding white of the snow and the biting cold. They ran, slipping and staggering, putting distance between themselves and the dormant beast. They formed a ragged line, turning to look, expecting at any moment to see the orange bloom of an explosion. It never came. The combination of cutting the engines, the freezing temperatures, and the sheer, dumb luck of the fuel not igniting had saved them. The fortress sat there a ruined, majestic thing. Its belly was shredded, its propellers bent like petals, its ball turret socket a gaping wound. But its pressure cabin, the crew compartment, was largely intact. The spine of the aircraft had held. The turning point was not a single act of gunfire or a brilliant tactical maneuver. It was the culmination of 100 small acts of disciplined airmanship in the face of certain death. It was Lieutenant Kidd's decision to fly onto the ice, not into the sea. It was the crew's methodical lightening of the aircraft. It was the choice of Goose Bay's frozen runway. It was the co-pilot's steady hand on the throttles. It was the engineer's accurate damage assessment that prevented futile, distracting efforts. It was every man holding his position during those final, terrifying seconds. The 200-mile-per-hour slide was not an accident. It was a controlled, desperate, and ultimately perfect act of crash landing executed on a surface no one had ever planned for. Rescue vehicles, alerted to their emergency, arrived within minutes to find 10 shaken, but miraculously whole, airmen standing in the snow. The medics checked them over. Apart from cuts, bruises, and a case of severe shock, there were no injuries. Not a single broken bone. Not a single life lost. They had achieved the statistically impossible, a successful belly landing of a fully loaded B-17 with a 100% crew survival rate. The aftermath was one of stunned disbelief, then growing recognition. An investigation of the wreckage confirmed the crew's account. The collision with the swell had been a 1-in-a-million event, and their survival an even greater miracle. The B-17 patched up was beyond repair, a write-off. But it had given its life for its crew, a final, magnificent act of the sturdy design that earned the fortress its name. For their extraordinary skill, courage, and presence of mind, Lieutenant John K. Kidd and Lieutenant William S. Farnsworth were awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. The enlisted crew members each received the Air Medal. The official citation praised their exceptional aeronautical skill and coolness in the face of almost certain disaster. The legacy of Patched Up is more than a tale of survival. It became a textbook case, studied by pilots and engineers. It proved the incredible durability of the B-17 airframe and provided vital, hard-won data on crash survivability. Most importantly, it served as a powerful morale booster, a tangible symbol that, even when every piece of equipment failed, human determination and disciplined procedure could still snatch victory from the jaws of fate. It was a story whispered in briefing rooms and mess halls, the story of the fortress that landed without its gear, and the 200-mile-per-hour slide that saved every man. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to World War II Records as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.